Welcome back. If you are just joining us for the first time today, I am Claire Natola. I am the Education Coordinator for the Vermont Cheese Council. I want to remind you of some logistical points. Please feel free to use the chat area to say hello, introduce yourself, make any observations or comments to the group during the presentations. If this is your first session of the day, you're more than welcome to practice with the chat window now by just saying hi and letting us know where you're from. But if you have questions for any of our presenters, we ask you to put those questions in the Q&A window instead. Chad Beckwith, say hi, Chad. He's monitoring the Q&A section for this presentation. So thank you for doing that, Chad. So just remember, and I'll reiterate this in the chat, put your questions for the presenter in the Q&A window, not in the chat window. If you have any technical issues, please email info@vtcheese.com. That's info@vtcheese.com. And I will paste that into the chat as well. And I also want to remind you that we have a social media challenge for today. I will paste that in the chat as we go along. And a reminder that our social media challenge is up on our SCED website. And it is, what are you most grateful for in your career path? So share a picture of yourself or of whatever or whomever you're grateful for in your career path and tag it with our hashtags ACWC24 and cheese gratitude. And I'll put all of that in the chat. Excuse me. Just a quick reminder that we'll be recording each session, and we'll have those recordings available through the SCED platform, just in case you need to step away so you won't miss anything. And we will email everyone when the entire slate of recordings is ready to watch. So let's jump right in. I would like to introduce you to Carrie Collegian. Carrie is an associate research professor in the Department of Food Science at Penn State. And for our international attendees, that is the Pennsylvania State University. Carrie provides technical support to the dairy industry and delivers outreach programs here at home and abroad on improving safety and quality of dairy products. She lectures on topics such as dairy preventative controls, dairy basics for small-scale processors, cheese making, cultured products, much, much more. Her research is focused on creating tools and resources for small-scale cheesemakers and other value-added dairy processors to improve the quality of their products and to meet food safety regulations. So we are so honored to have her here today. Carrie, thank you so much for joining us, and you're welcome to take it away.
My pleasure to be here. So I'm going to start out by telling you what I am grateful for in my career. I have had an amazing number of mentors that have showed me the way, and I have have an amazing amount of connections. And through those connections, I've had some great travels, and I've been allowed into facilities. So I'm going to start out by thanking all of you. I'm not sure who's online. I haven't seen the attendees list, but if you see a picture that looks very familiar to you because it was inside your plant, I'm not naming names. I'm using them as teaching examples. You let me in your facility, you let me take pictures. So I am very grateful for everybody for that. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen. Whoops, actually, hang on a second. Hit the wrong button. Let's see. Back to the beginning. All right, so I was asked to do a deep dive on food safety and affinage. And we looked at what are the risks in my affinage process. And I started to think of the concept of what a deep dive is. And we went snorkeling about a year ago, and we were in some pretty interesting places. And I was kind of thinking, we've been looking at our pictures, and I was thinking about getting prepared for snorkeling and diving. So I started to think about what we do. And when you're diving, the first thing you do is you learn how to swim. And in all of my travels, I've talked to people about food safety, and I always find that things mean different things to different people, even though we're using the same terms. So we're going to start out by swimming in the same pool and go over some really basic concepts to get everybody on the same page with me. Mostly so that when I say something, you know where I'm coming from, because everybody has a different idea of what things mean, and it's really interesting. So let's start out by looking at the fundamentals of food safety. And Claire mentioned we have some international people on board. In the US, this is kind of where we start. This is our 21 Code of Federal Regulations, Part 117, our current GMPs, hazard analysis, risk-based preventive controls for human food. I promise you, this is not going to be one of those talks that you guys have seen where speakers put this up and then shown you how many people have been hospitalized over time and all of that other stuff. But I want to use this as the basis because all food processors kind of have to come to these regulations and follow what's inside of them. The large processors are doing a big hazard analysis. The small processors that fall under the exemption have some different things that they apply for. And if you are a small processor in the US, you can fill out this qualification form. And it basically says that you meet these qualified requirements, which are financial. And because you're a small entity, you can manage your food safety risks in two ways. On this form, most people check this box on the bottom, and it says that the above named facility is in compliance with state, local, county, tribal, or other non-federal food safety laws. What that means basically is you are complying with your state regulations. Doesn't mean you have to have a hazard analysis, a food safety plan, whatever your local inspector says goes. I provide technical support in Pennsylvania, in other states around the world, and everybody enforces laws a little bit differently. In Pennsylvania, most of our small processors check this box and they do not have a food safety plan. The other way to manage food safety as a small entity is to actually not check this box, and this is what I would prefer to see people check, is this box. And what that says is that as an owner, I have identified the potential hazards with the food, I'm implementing preventive controls to address those hazards, and I am monitoring the performance of those preventive controls to ensure that they are effective. That's a lot of stuff tied up in there. It kind of sounds like you're doing a whole lot of what the large processors are doing. And the bottom line is you're doing a lot of it, not all of it. But we work in an area that has a known association with pathogens. So we are working in high risk foods. So my preference, no matter what your local processors or your local regulators say, is for everybody to actually do their own food safety plan. If you choose, so regardless of whether you're doing the food safety plan, all processors need to follow the subpart A, which is general provisions. And what's tied up in there is training, and that training must be documented. In there, it says that management must be trained to manage people. Supervisors should have the training that they need in how to supervise people. And individuals on the line have to have tasks appropriate to their duties. What that means is the person that's running the HTST needs to be trained to do that. The person that's doing maintenance needs to be trained to do that. And the person running the lab needs to be able to be trained to do that. Excuse me. So everybody needs to be trained in the tasks appropriate to their job. But they also need to be trained in food safety aspects appropriate to their job. Does that mean the maintenance guy needs to be trained? Well, yeah, because they're coming in and they're taking pieces of equipment apart, and you want to make sure that when they put that back together that they're following proper food safety procedures, because you're going to have food contact coming up. So everybody needs to be trained as appropriate. If you need a food safety plan written, it must be trained by somebody who is a preventive controls qualified individual. Just like we're learning to dive, there's training that you need to have to go from swimming to snorkeling to diving. And a food safety plan, while it's not difficult, it is complicated. So having the proper training is important. So no matter who you are and what you're processing, everybody needs to be trained. All processors also need to follow GMPs. Again, there's lots of documentation that goes with this. And GMPs covers a whole lot of areas, not just personnel. Again, this is not a talk following through these things, so I'm just going to move right on from there. But what I am going to talk about is, as in this slide, it says we have addressed the hazards, we've implemented preventive controls, and we're monitoring. So that means now we are looking at having a food safety plan. That means we are, so now we've kind of moved from just swimming in these waters of kind of knowing the basics to really starting to snorkel. Now we're getting a little bit deeper. Now we've got to go in and do a hazard analysis. So we need some training in knowing what we need to look for. We need to know how to pick our preventive controls. We need to understand how to monitor those and how to verify what things are required, as well as how to write a recall plan. So now we're getting into a little bit deeper. And without getting into too much detail, but again, make sure everybody's on the same page, I want to talk a little bit about the hazard analysis, because the hazard analysis can be confusing. The words hazard analysis are both a process and a form. You will go through the process of conducting a hazard analysis, but you will write all of your details on the hazard analysis form. So the first thing you do when you're conducting a hazard analysis is you identify the hazards associated with each step in your manufacturing process. So in order to figure out what each step in your manufacturing process is, you make a flow diagram. And this is a flow diagram that we made for a raw milk Gouda that we use as a teaching example. And you can see we have all of our inputs. We're receiving raw milk, we're storing it. We broke out things going into the vat. We're doing a little bit of a rinse. We're mixing a brine down here. So we've got water coming in, we've got salt coming in, we've got all kinds of things coming in, things going out. So for each step, we now have to identify the hazards in each one of these boxes. And when we look at identifying the hazards, these are biological, chemical, or physical agents that are reasonably likely to cause illness or injury. It means it's going to make somebody sick, or it's going to cut them. It's going to cause some kind of illness or injury. These things may occur naturally. They can be introduced unintentionally or intentionally. We may be introducing allergens because we're making, a cheese ball that has nuts. So we're actually introducing an allergen. Or we're now making, an everything flavored goat cheese spread, and everything bagel seasonings now have sesame. So we have now just introduced an allergen, which is a chemical hazard that we now need to figure out how to manage to prevent problems in our customers. So these are the hazards that you're looking for. As you start to become aware and go through training of how to do a hazard analysis, you'll start to learn what all of these hazards are and which ones apply to your facilities. Again, this is where that alternate training comes from. So once you've kind of looked at what all of these hazards are, you go back to each one of these steps and you say, for each one of these, did you identify a chemical or a physical or biological hazard? If you did, then you determine the severity of that hazard. And then you have to determine what preventive controls you need to use, what types of procedures and practices can you use to prevent those from causing problems. It may be a process control such as pasteurization. It could be an allergen control. It could be some type of sanitation control. So that is kind of what is all tied up in doing a hazard analysis. You'll start to end up with a very long form. This is the hazard analysis form. And this is just an example from the food safety documents that we put together. And here's one area that we noticed. So this is actually transporting over to our aging room. In our example, you'll see we've got something highlighted because we looked at being able to address this as in two ways of requiring a preventive control and not requiring a preventive control. You have to kind of take a look at what you're doing in your own facility to figure out how to manage these things. But you go through each of these boxes and say, is there a biological? Is there a chemical? Is there a physical hazard? And once you put all of that together with your GMPs and any other prerequisite programs in your recall plan, now you guys know that you have started out and got a nice food safety plan, and you are swimming in the waters. You're just starting to do a little bit of snorkeling. But now it's time to really get in and start to do that deep dive. So getting into the weeds is really starting to look at what's going on, the hazards specifically in cheese making. So let's start to take a look at some things that are important. I identified, here's some areas where we're going to look at hazards. Take a look at what's in raw milk and ingredients. We'll look at the cheese making and aging process. We'll look at packaging, the environment. I'm also going to talk about personnel. These are pathogens commonly associated with dairy products. We talked about biological, chemical, and physical. Most people think of biological when they think of hazards, but you can't forget the chemical and the physical as well. When we look at biological hazards, The biggest one that we are worried with is Listeria, but there are a couple other pathogens that tend to grow in the cold as well. For cheesemakers, usually Listeria is our biggest concern. We have seen outbreaks with E. coli, with Campylobacter, and with Salmonella. Another concern in cheese making is Listeria can grow in 10% salt, which is, these are your storage, basically a storage brine for feta, and they can survive in 20 to 30% salt, which is a saturated brine that we're going to use for a lot of different things. Take a look at where Listeria comes from. It's coming from the water, the soil, and the environment. It's coming in with people, it's coming in with animals, it could be coming in with the milk. It's just living out in the environment. It's got some pretty nasty characteristics, and one of the worst problems is the disease onset could be several months before somebody gets Listeria. So Listeria is a really big concern in the dairy industry, and particularly in cheese making. And we'll come back to Listeria. But I wanted to point out the pathogens that were important. So now as we start to look at the different steps, start to look at raw milk and ingredients. So as you're bringing your raw milk, and start to think in your facility, what's coming in. Potentially we have pathogens coming in, depends on your milk source, depends on how that's handled, how healthy your animals are, all kinds of things in sanitation along the lines from the farm, all the way till the time it gets into your cheese vat. For chemical things we want to take a look at. Allergens, well, milk is an allergen, so basically we're labeling everything with allergens. I already mentioned the instance of sesame. Drug residues. We have to buy it from the pasteurized milk ordinance. We are required in the US to test all milk for drug residues. We test for tetracyclines, no, beta-lactams, sorry, we test for beta-lactams, and all milk must be tested. If mycotoxins are a problem in your area, that's something you should think about. If you're having problems with moldy feet, but again, this is a question that you have to look at your situation, say, does this apply to me? Is this, but it's a potential of something that's coming in with the raw milk. For potential physical hazards, there could be ingredient packaging, there could be pallet splinters, there could be, if you're bringing things in glass bottles, you may have glass coming in. So here's some places that you're going to look at in the raw milk and your ingredients coming in. When we get into the cheese making, brining, and aging process, there's lots of different types of hazards to look at. Biological, if we've got pathogens coming in with the milk, we can look at the pathogen growth during cheese making. If we don't have proper acidification, we can also have problems. We can get contamination from improperly cleaned equipment, biofilms on water, contaminated water. Another biological problem could be cheese mites. Chemical hazards, again, these are all pretty standard. If you've been through running a hazard analysis, these things should be second nature. If not, I'm giving you a lot to think about. What's your cleaning chemical processes? Again, do you have any allergens present? Is your water clean? Physical hazards. Are you doing a good maintenance program on your cheese wires and harps? If you're using wood boards, are you checking those, and do you have a good maintenance program? Again, other places you can have bits of pieces coming off into your product and having physical hazards. When we move into the packaging area, we have biological, both things that came with the cheese, but we also now have that environment. Our cheese is exposed to the air. And the federal regulations say that if you have ready-to-eat food exposed to the air, you need to have an environmental monitoring program to ensure that your air is free from pathogens. So that's something, if you don't have your program, something to think about getting started. Again, in all places, you're looking at cleaning chemicals and any kind of packaging materials. Again, we're still doing that slow descent. We're kind of getting a little bit deeper, things that we're looking at. This is a new area. We had a student studying apple packing houses, and she just published a paper, and they found in the waxing area for apples that there were more Listeria present in biofilms, and it got me thinking about our cheese industry and the waxing and paracoat areas. So this is kind of a brand new thought of mine, but if you guys are doing Paracoat or have a waxing room, you might want to do some extra sampling in that area to make sure that you don't have listeria and biofilms building up in that area. Again, starting to look at the environment, really looking mostly at pathogens. And I put in here personnel as a hazard in cheese making. These are really managed as GMPs and prerequisite programs. And I hate to pick on people, but whether it's personnel practices of personal hygiene, or sometimes we just don't think about it through traffic patterns. I have an example that I saw at the American Cheese Society many years ago. Shauna from Bleeding Heart Cheese. They had a listeria outbreak and they had really good food safety practices in place, and they almost lost their business. They finally found the source of it, and they were going to pick up goat's milk. And when the employees were going to pick up the goat's milk, they were playing with the kids, the little baby goats, and picking them up. And as they were picking up the baby goats who were rolling in the dirt, they were coming back into the plant and they were carrying in listeria and other contaminants on their clothes. So it's thinking about things like traffic patterns, starting to think about where people are walking, where those hazards coming from are what you really need to start thinking about. So that's kind of, we did some swimming, we did some snorkeling, we started doing some diving. This is all that general stuff that hopefully everybody that has a food safety plan has got down packed. And I haven't told you anything new. Which means you're
Terry,
going
I've
to,
got one question to
yep,
interrupt you. Christine asks, what would air pathogen testing and monitoring entail? From your
doing
previous slide.
air plates, and I would work with somebody that with a testing lab. But usually you're going to either put air plates out or you're going to swab areas of the, you might swab parts of the floor, parts of zones 3, zones 4, different parts of equipment to get an idea of what is in that. And there's all kinds of information out there on setting up environmental monitoring programs. Chad, this is a good point to take any other questions on the really general stuff. Kind of just any general questions on hazards in cheese making or general food safety plan stuff.
Yeah, we've got someone also asked where they could find mentors to learn this in the industry, if you have any suggestions.
Mentors in the industry, that's a really good question. I'm going to come back to that one.
Yep.
Let's come back to that one because it's going to kind of be part of wrapping up as mentors and some next steps and what to do.
Yeah, and the only other one is some of the original slides you had some diagrams of hazard analysis. Will those be available after the presentation?
I've been told that the slides will be available. Some of the hazard analysis, those are actually coming from the food safety plan, the template example that we have on our Penn State website that should be available free of charge. I will say that I am a little behind and I've had a few things expire. So at the moment, as of today, it may not be available. At the end of this presentation, I give you the link to our department, to that website. Keep an eye on it. It will be coming back in the next month or so, but I have a whole document on how to write your own food safety plan. So, yep, we'll have some things at the end.
That's great. All right, that's it for now.
All right. Okay, so shall we start by, let's take a look at that deep dive. We're now kind of going to the bottom. So we've been trained. Everybody's been trained. We know what we're looking for. We're going to go down and really, when I start to think about what the tools are that I need to figure out what the risks in my affinage process are and just the risks in general. My favorite tools are my brain and a flashlight. One of the best things you can do is know as much about your process as you possibly can. And I'm going to keep coming back to that because it's your process, it's your cheese, it's your milk. It's your milk handling from the moment those animals are cared for to milked to transport till it gets into your facility, till you start to make the cheese, till it gets moved around to your affinage and everything else. This is a very individual thing. So what are you doing? What does your facility look like? This is an optimal, well, I shouldn't say optimal. We tried to optimize as best as possible. You can see from the bottom, this is the Penn State Extension raw milk gout teaching example. This is in those documents that you will have access to, if not today, within the next week or so. This was put together to kind of is an example of a small cheese maker that we have a storefront here. This is, again, this is raw milk, so we have no pasteurizer. We're making Gouda, so we've got a brine tank. We've got raw milk coming in. We've got storage. We've got our cheese vat. We have a laboratory, an office. We've got a locker room. So we're going to start to look at, what's going on in this facility, what's happening around here, what are all of these things being done? So let's start to look at some questions and taking that deep dive, because what do you need to know about your affinage process? First of all, it's not a dumb question. What are you making? Making raw milk cheese? Are you making pasteurized milk cheese? Are you making both? Are you keeping those cheeses completely segregated until the raw milk cheese is legally aged? Life is stranger than fiction. I can't make these things up. I'm going to give you some examples of some things we have seen. Working with a cheesemaker, their brine tank for their raw milk cheese was in the storage cooler where they were storing their pasteurized cheese, which means anytime you walked in with raw milk cheese, you now have total raw milk in proximity to all of that pasteurized cheese. So now all of that pasteurized cheese is potentially contaminated. So make sure you are segregating them. What are you doing when you're pasteurizing? What kinds of processing do you have? Are you making both cheeses on the same day? So think about those kinds of things. Are there inherent food safety risks associated with these cheese varieties? And I have a couple of different varieties up here for an example. Inherent cheese risks. Let's take a look at the top example. A Swiss cheese. Well, Swiss cheese, we don't see a lot of outbreaks, but Swiss cheese does need to sit in a warm room for about 2 months in order for those eyes to grow. So we're talking about a relatively high pH of a cheese to make the curd elastic. And you're looking at 55 to 65 to 70 degrees. So if you've got things that like to grow, you've got good growth conditions. I'm looking at this cheese. This is a cloth bound cheddar on what's looking like some very rusty shelves. I'm going to come back to this one for the shelves, but are there food safety risks? Well, this is a low moisture cheese. This is a cloth bound cheddar. It is completely encased in cloth, in lard, and mold. There is no food grade, no surface that people are going to eat in contact with those shelves. So pretty safe here. Now we get into cheeses such as a washed rind, where we're getting into higher pHs, higher moistures. This I kind of cheated. These are bries. I took this picture in England 2 years ago. This is a raw milk brie. This would not be allowed in the US because to get this at its prime point of eating is not going to last for the 60-day aging. So it depends on what you're making, where you're making it. What are those risks inherent in that type of cheese? So some of those things you're going to look at is what's the pH? What is the percent moisture? What is the salt and moisture? Because that's going to be a really important thing for looking at that safety concern. Which brings me to the questions of what are the optimal manufacturing processes, aging procedures, and composition targets for the cheese I am making? Do I know those? Do I have them? Do I repeat them? What am I actually doing? If I'm not hitting those targets, am I posing food safety risks? If I'm supposed to have a cheese that's 37% moisture, but I keep not paying attention, I'm coming out at 39% moisture, do I have a food safety risk? Maybe, maybe not. It depends on the cheese. It depends on other things. That's only something that you can assess based on that cheese variety and what you're doing. So that's the first place to start with this deep dive, is really looking at what are the cheeses you're making? What are the potential risks that come with that cheese? If I'm making raw milk, what things am I bringing in? If I'm making pasteurized milk, I have kill steps, but I also have an issue with post-pasteurization contamination. So never think because you're making pasteurized cheese that it is always safe, because you can always contaminate it after that process. Okay, so the next question is, how is my facility laid out and who has access to what and where? Who am I going to let in my facility in addition to my employees? Do I have a visitor policy for the inspectors, my milk haulers, my delivery people? We're seeing increasing agritourism. Where are you going to let them go? How are they going to be dressed? What can they do? We talked to somebody who's a single cheesemaker, and even though he's got a sign on his doors, he's got a little vestibule and then a set of swinging doors into the cheese room, but a lot of times he's the only one there. And the FedEx guy refuses to read the note that says, please do not enter, and disrupt him. So the FedEx guy's always walking into the cheese room. So these are things you've got to look at, figure out what kinds of things do you need to put in place. You can't read this very well, but this visitor policy, I would like to thank Joe at Stitchelton Dairy, and I'd like to thank Kathy Strange for hooking me up with Joe. I went to visit Joe on sabbatical, and I'm going to read you parts of his visitor policy. Yes, everybody has visitor policies. They're really boring. So it's Stitchelton Dairy. Our business is committed to producing a safe, high quality product. We love having visitors, but it's important that you make yourselves aware of the following personal hygiene procedures and adhere to them. Visitors must be accompanied by a member of the staff at all times. You cannot choose which one. Please follow any instructions given to you by your guide. There will be a quiz at the end. Let your guide know immediately if you have any illness or disease that may present a food hygiene risk, no matter how unpleasant. You will be given protective clothing to wear before entering the production area to comply with our policy and to make you look ridiculous. Please wear it at all times. Loose items of jewelry are not allowed, and you will kindly ask to remove them. If they do fall in the milk of vat, they become the property of Stitchelton. Drugs. If you are injecting heroin or taking any more innocuous medicines, they are not allowed in any food production areas. Please alert your guide to any drugs you have on you, as well as their estimated street value. And I've already started giggling, and that's what Joe said, is he said that's how he knows people are actually reading it. How many times do people walk in your plants, look at your visitor policy, don't read it, and sign the bottom? He goes on to say some other things. Our milk contains milk, which is an allergen. There are too many allergens to list, so don't bring any foods into the dairy. Wash your hands well to get the peanut butter off. Please do not touch cheese or equipment unless instructed to do so by your guide. Touching the cheese maker is encouraged. Please abide by our rules. Remember, if you break these rules, you could make someone ill, but we still get the blame. So, what kind of controls do you have on the people coming and going? If we come back to this picture, we have a storefront here. Yes, we want a lot of people to come in and look in our cheese room because we're doing that. But here we've actually chosen to put a window. So trying to limit some of these things for agritourism and being open to people. So some things that you can look at. So things to think about. What control measures do you need at transition areas? I've been in a lot of places, what are you asking your employees to wear? Some people have to wear hairnets, some people wear bandanas. I've seen bald men wear hairnets in full garb and people with hair just flowing out of bandanas and hair falling into cheese vats. So, what are you having people wear and how are they changing? This is a plant I was in. In order to get into the facility, you have to step over this bench. You literally cannot walk through. It is, I think it was bolted to the door, to the floor, but you might have been able to move it for emergencies. So basically, this is the reminder. You sit your butt down, you take off your street clothes here, you swing your butt around, you get your new boots, you put on your hairnets and your lab coat, and then you can walk in. So what kinds of things do you need in different places? You've got transition areas, you've got haulers coming in from the milk bay, you've got laboratory people coming from the laboratory and taking samples. You need to look at how those transitions are. What do people need to wear? Where are they going? Next, again, getting in and out of the aging facilities. Let's kind of take a look at getting into the aging room itself. What's the path from the make room to the aging room? Sometimes we have control over these, sometimes we don't. I've seen some pretty interesting things. Aging rooms may be convenient. They may be in another building. If you're taking the cheese out to another building, is it covered? What kind of tubs are you putting the cheese in to carry it from one place to the next? Is it something that you went to Lowe's and got, which is likely not food grade, or did you get it from a restaurant supply house where it's food grade Rubbermaid designed for storing food? I said we couldn't make this up. I had a graduate student observe a cheesemaker carry the cheese. It was about a 20-pound wheel of cheese, literally grabbed it, bear hugged it against his body from the make room, out the door, down the sidewalk, not a covered area, into the make room. This is also the same cheesemaker that tended to go into the barn and then directly into the cheese room without changing clothes or boots. So some of these things are things you have to think about, things you can't make up, things you have no idea what to tell a consultant. These are things that you know by looking at what's going on in your facility. So other things to take a look at. What activities are going on for which cheeses? How are your cheeses segregated? Do you have one aging room, a giant cave where you're moving cheeses in or out? Near an air handling system? Do you have separate rooms where you've got different corridors for different places? So you've got high moisture cheese in one area, low moisture cheese in another. Another cheesemaker had one cooler and handled moisture by opening and closing tubs. So let's look about where some of those problems are going to lie, because things like condensate pans, drip pans, pooling water, Listeria loves these kinds of things. So what do you have in your facility? What things can change? How do you handle that? It's going to depend on the cheese variety. It's going to depend on what you're doing. How can you fix that? Where are those issues? Another area that is a really big concern in aging facilities is brines. I already mentioned the tank location. I have seen brines in brines for raw milk cheese in aging coolers for pasteurized cheese. So you've got cross-contamination problems. I have seen cheese brines snaking through facilities, which are kind of cool. Remember that Listeria can grow. So let's take a look at cross-contamination. What kind of maintenance do you have? These are really old saturated brines. This is a facility in Italy. These are Parmesan wheels. You know, who knows how often they're changing that brine and what they're doing to clean it. This is a Munster plant in Wisconsin, high throughput. They've got a beautiful filtration system. They're pulling out fines. They're pulling samples, checking pH, adjusting for calcium chloride on a regular basis. So brine maintenance. Do you have a brine maintenance policy? I've seen people change brines with every batch of cheese. I have seen brines that are 25 years old. It is a personal preference, but regardless of what you do and you need to do for your cheese, make sure that that is not a source of contamination. If you're using brines, you should be checking that regularly for Listeria. How often? Well, let's think about it. How often do you need to check it? What's your throughput? If all of a sudden your cheese is tagged for Listeria and it was a brine cheese, how much cheese did you make from the last time you tested that brine that now needs to be sequestered for a potential recall? So again, what are you doing in your facility? One more thing to really take a look at is washed rind cheeses. These are potentially tricky. They are high moisture cheeses. They have pH gradients. This is Saint Nectaire. Sister Noella had a chance to visit us many years ago, and I had a chance to taste this. But looking at this small little, 2-inch cheese, there's a huge pH gradient, which means lots of potential for Listeria growth and supporting other pathogens. When you're making these cheeses, what kind of washes are you using? Are you bringing in pathogens or problems with the wash? Are you changing the wash every day? Is it sitting around? Again, these are things to think about. What kind of procedures do you have in place to make sure that you are pathogen free when you're doing that? On washing and utensils, are you using rags? Are you using brushes? Here's a place where you can look at physical contamination, brush bristles. A big problem of potential cross-contamination. If you've got listeria and you're using a rag on one cheese and that one wheel was contaminated, you can now move it from one wheel to the next and the next. There's been some really good research that came out of Vermont with good procedures about cleaning and baking your brushes. Make sure you're using good cleanable brushes so that your brushes and your things are not sources of contamination. So when we start to do that deep dive into that affinage, the real questions are, what are the risks in my affinage process? And so the question is for you, what are the risks in yours? You need to think about that. You need to sit down and go through and develop that food safety plan. Go through, because by the time you get to affinage, it's not just what are the risks there, it's everything you brought into it. Was the milk contaminated? Because if your milk was contaminated and the cheese was contaminated, you're bringing that into affinage. So that food safety starts way at the beginning, making sure everything is fine. So get your food safety plan, go in, take a look at all of those different steps. Again, this is something we did as a grant. Thank you to the Northeast SARE. So I'm going to leave you with, I've got just a few more minutes and plenty of time for questions. So I'm going to do a little bit of a thinking exercise. And really, this gets back to a lot of people that ask for mentors. For mentors, reach out to your local extension offices. Cornell has some good programs. Actually, Cornell has a really great office hour program. We have it at Penn State. Wisconsin's got mentors. Wisconsin's got some really good information on their website. North Carolina's got some. Trying to remember what's out west. We've got a lot on the East Coast in the Midwest. So lots of people out there. There are courses you can take you've got the preventive controls courses that are taught in Wisconsin. They're taught at Cornell. We teach them. I was going to put up the slide with dates and forgot to get that. I'm sorry. We've got a PCQI course coming up in October. And I also teach, for people that don't need that, some courses for small scale cheesemakers. I teach a 1 day of how to basically write a food safety plan, how to get yourself through the hazard analysis. And I can get that information out to people. I can send that to Claire and get those dates out to you. We've got some dates coming up in Lancaster in May and in August at University Park. So you make your food safety plan. So start to think about, how much do you, and I always hear people, well, I don't have time, just send me the documents, I'll fill them out. We had somebody come to our course. He spent some upwards of $15,000 on a food safety plan, and he sat through the 3-day PCQI course and went, wow, my consultant missed this and this and this, because only you know your facility. So think about, how much do you think a 1-day training course will cost your company? So you got to think about the cost, the travel, your employee labor's cost of not making cheese, plus the time. It's not going to be cheap, and I'm not saying it is. It's not going to be time consuming. But let's start to put that in perspective. How much do you think a recall is going to cost you? How much do you think a recall with a foodborne outbreak that makes somebody sick or kills is going to cost your business? When I was on sabbatical, Jane said, HACCP is the cheapest insurance policy you will ever buy. And it's one of my favorite quotes from sabbatical. So one more little exercise. I think everybody should be able to agree with this statement that says foods that I purchase should not hurt me, make me sick, or kill me or my family. So, okay, these are old. 62 deaths from cheese to a single source, 1985. Outbreak of listeria, case of Fresco, February 6, 2024. Today is February 13th. This is an ongoing outbreak with cases dating back to 2014. Whole genome sequencing is linking these back together. They've now been able to trace it. So, Crave Brothers, unfortunately, we had illnesses and a death. They, again, very vigilant about doing their food safety plans, but sometimes you just don't know. So you've gotta be careful. You really don't want your name on newspapers like this. And sometimes it's just a matter of being implicated. They don't necessarily know. And it gets to issues about confirmed patients. One died and a pregnant woman lost her baby. So that gets into that YOPI population, the young, the old, the pregnant, and the immunocompromised. Our immune systems might be fine, but we might be sitting at a table where somebody gets sick off the same food we are. So that company, woman lost her baby. We have a lot of ads for drugs. There's a lot of immunocompromised people. So how would you feel if that was your company up there and you took out somebody's grandma? What about if you lost your neighbor's kid? What about if your product or your friend's product, you lost your own kid? It's a pretty scary thing. Food safety is pretty serious. And I wanted to learn about food safety attitudes. So when I did my sabbatical, I went to England and Ireland. And my colleague told me as I was traveling from one place to the other, she said, you're going to go by this place and you have to stop here. So I did. The highway literally goes right by and I had to stop. And I'm standing there and I am seeing this thing and I'm thinking, some things in life truly are a mystery. But you know what, folks? Dairy food safety is not one of them. We know what to do. We know where to look. Sometimes we can't find that smoking gun, but we know what we're doing. So what are the risks in your affinage process? It's for you to figure out. We've got some good resources and materials out here for you. There is our Dairy Foods Extension site. It's extension.psu.edu. You can go out, click on it, and you'll get down to the Dairy Foods Processing site, and we have all kinds of information for you. So with that, I'm going to leave that for you to think, and I'm going to stop sharing and open up for questions.
All right, great presentation, Carrie. We've got a couple of questions. One is we've seen some local cheese producers in the area who go into their barn and then make room. Can you help us understand the risks associated with that?
Yeah, lots of risks associated with that. Where do most pathogens come from? Listeria is in the soil, so you're walking through the soil. Lots of it comes from the animals. A lot of these are enteric pathogens, so things, little bits of feces on the animal and the animal's hair because they're laying down in the bedding. So you are a direct conduit of bringing pathogens in, hence you should be changing shoes. If you can't do a full change of clothes, be putting on a lab coat, full hairnet. These are really bad practices. I have seen this way too much. Just stop them. Do whatever you can. I realize sometimes there's issues, but you can have a pair of clogs and a lab coat if you need to go back and forth. So do what you can, please.
All right. Here's another question for you. Recently at the Vermont Cheese Council meeting, the state of Vermont is going to be offering pathogen testing for raw milk cheeses in their lab, which they normally test milk. What is a good suggestion you have for Vermont cheesemakers or other cheesemakers to take advantage of programs like that?
Yes, do it. Anything you can, anytime you get testing. This starts, and if you've never done it before, this is where start to develop your environmental monitoring, because that's going to be the most important things. One, you want to make sure you're not getting anything contaminated, but you can start with looking at that environmental monitoring in the make room. Do you have any pathogens coming in there? Any of those other key areas that I talked about? What are the big hot spots? Sit down, take a look at your whole facility. This is where going through that hazard analysis is going to show you what are the worst case scenarios. But if you've got free testing, when you're developing an environmental monitoring program, you're going to start by looking at the hot spots, and you're going to take more samples initially until you learn what your facility looks like. You're going to take samples at the worst possible time in the middle of cheese making. You're going to see how you cleaned up. So take advantage of that free testing in as many samples as you can with a good plan. And eventually over time, you can say, okay, well, this is always clean, so I don't need to test this, but oh, this one's a really good indicator of what I'm doing. So yes, free testing always.
Yeah, I think there might be a small fee associated with that, but they are going to make it really affordable. But all right, we got some other questions rolling in. Can you recommend online HACCP training course? Someone found one 18-hour certification for nearly $200. Do you have any other good suggestions?
I have no idea who's in the audience. There's probably some people that I know, and those people that I know that I'm blunt. My suggestion is don't do it. This is way too confusing. There's documents out there. You can download the manual, but taking an online course, you will not be engaged. Get to a place where you can sit in person. There are hybrid things on the FSPCA. Actually, Cornell offers one that's hybrid where you can do a lot of the learning online, but then you get to do stuff in person. Our PCQI training is only in person, and our one-day courses are only in person.
We have about 10 minutes left. I'm sorry to interrupt.
Right, nope, perfect.
Yeah, and all right, another question, cheese mites, what do you have can you kind of explain any other concerns you have with them beyond damaging to the rind?
It depends on where you live and depends on what cheese contest you're judging. I am also a cheese judge. If we see cheese mites at the ACS contest, they are really bad and we're not supposed to judge the cheese and take them down. If I'm in the world contest and I see an aged farmstead cheddar coming in and there's a few mites on it, yeah, I kind of expect that. Cheese mites. If you're seeing cheese mites on cheeses, you wouldn't expect them, like, you know, aged farmstead cheddars. Yeah, I expect them there. If I'm seeing cheese mites on my, you know, my bloomy rinds and things, that's a sanitation issue. Excessive mites are a sanitation issue. So that's my concern. If I see a cheese that's excessively mitey, yeah, will I eat it? I probably will. I'll taste the inside because I know there's probably something really good inside, but will I downgrade the cheesemaker? Yeah, because if it's really bad, you know that they're just not keeping their facilities clean.
Yeah, great. Going back to the pathogen testing from the state for raw milk cheeses, cheesemakers asking if they should test every single batch.
Part of it, it's gonna get expensive. What you should really do is sit down and kind of take a look at an overall plan. And this is where I'm getting a little out of my expertise for developing a plan. But you will kind of develop over time. And sometimes you're testing the cheese, which is actually testing the end product, which is going to get contaminated. If you're testing the environment in the facilities and the utensils, you're getting that environmental, and that's telling you how effective your cleaning is. So you're going to get a little bit more from testing that. That cheese is still a good test to have, but you may, depending upon price and time, may get more information initially. That, and don't misunderstand and say I'm not promoting testing your cheese. I'm just saying you have a limited budget, limited resources. Use them wisely.
Yeah. And for cheesemakers not in Vermont, do you know any other labs or services that provide that?
Places like Eurofins and BioMario will, but and why can I not think of it? I'm gonna have a brain in Wisconsin, Precision Labs. They used to Precision Labs out of Monroe. They are they were started by cheesemakers for a cheesemaking lab. They let you you can become a member and get reduced pricing on cheese analysis. And you can also have 2 or 3 cheesemakers in the same area, combined shipments. So check out, I'm pretty sure it's Precision Biolabs, and somebody out there I'm sure will figure this out and they're using them and can pop that in the chat for you guys.
Yeah. And I'm not positive whether or not the state lab in Vermont is actually going to be open to other cheesemakers in the region sending samples to if the price is right. If we get more people testing, the price is probably going to be cheaper. So all right, we got some other questions.
One more thing on that one, Chad. I can tell you that Pennsylvania does not, the state labs do not, and most university labs will not unless you are in some type of a improvement program. So before, we often get questions about, can you test this? And the answer is no, we do not compete with the commercial labs. So we will refer you to those commercial labs that I just mentioned.
Yeah, great. All right, another question. When testing cheese, should you swab the rind as well as the interior for samples?
What are you testing for?
Leslie, do you know what are you going to be testing for, or what type of cheese? I'm not sure if she'll be able to answer.
And the other question is what are you testing for and why?
Yeah.
Are you testing for pathogens because you think it was contaminated in the packaging, so you're going to test the outside? Or do you think your milk was bad, so you're going to open it up and test the inside? In which case you may have wanted to test sooner before you actually made that into cheese. If you are doing a cut and wrap where you are cutting cheese into wedges and then wrapping those wedges, then yes, maybe swabbing that face of that cut to see if you're picking anything up, because that's now a little bit stickier than a rind. And when I said that, I actually just happened to think about brie when I said stickier. Depending on the cheese, it might not be, but now you've got a cut face. So again, you know, I hate answering questions with it kind of depends, but I can answer your question with 3 more questions. Hopefully what I'm doing is making you guys think.
Well, that's great.
Thanks, Val, for the Precision Biolabs. I just saw that come through the chat. Okay, I know I got 5 more minutes. So you guys is there any other questions coming through? Prioritize things.
Yeah. Oh, here's a question for you. With washing cheeses, a lot of Vermont cheesemakers do they'll wash their cheeses with wine or liquor of some type. Is there any other additional risks when using alcohol-based things to wash your cheeses?
I wouldn't expect other risks, but just be aware of what, is there anything else that can be growing in there? Did somebody make a strawberry wine from their garden where the strawberries weren't actually boiled? So maybe you're getting some yeasts and molds. That being said, people using things like leaves for wrapping and, flowers and herbs for decorating, are you bringing those in? So some of the biggest things with wash rinds is really the washing process and that contamination of one to the next. So making sure that, your washing utensils are clean and that you know what's in your wash.
Yeah. And do you think there's a greater risk with lower alcohol products such as like wine versus like if you were using something like a gin, which is
People wash with Brevy and water.
yeah.
So the answer is really no. The risks are going to be more in your sanitation practices. Are people coming in? Are they clean? Are they wearing good products? Are their hands clean? Are they not contaminating? Are they not setting the brush that they just washed down on the shelf where the blue cheese just was? Because,
Mhm.
things like that. Common sense, unfortunately, is not as common as you would like to think it is. So a lot of it's just paying attention to what you're doing and thinking about what you're doing.
Great.
And we have about 3 minutes left.
Awesome. Let's see, I don't see any questions in the field. If you guys have any more, send them, but I'll keep going. For cheesemakers that are bringing in other ingredients like herbs or other products to mix in with their cheeses, do you have any recommendations that they would check those products?
Certificate of analysis, not just your specifications, but a certificate of analysis that things are free of pathogens. If you're bringing things in and there might be a hazard for stones or sticks, obviously putting that into the specification. I do run into a lot of small cheesemakers that cannot get supplies. They can't get flavorings or things from larger suppliers that will give them a COA because they won't deal with these small cheesemakers. And some of the better recommendations we have, never go to the local co-op and buy things in bulk. I've had too many cheesemakers trying to make black pepper, coated things, and you're getting lots of mold problems because black pepper is known to have mold spores. You really want to get that irradiated. So even buying from the grocery store where you've got, McCormick, where you can trace that back, or from restaurant supply houses that they should be able to get back to the manufacturer. That's the best we've been able to come up with, is saying you bought it from a major commercial supplier. Good question.
Yes.
If you're harvesting from your own garden, make sure you're doing a quick boil or an alcohol dip. Doesn't work for flowers, but it will work for chestnut leaves for wrapping cheeses and such.
Carrie, thank you so much. This has been such an informative session, and we are honored and thrilled to have you as part of our presentation team. So thank you. And thank you, Chad, for fielding our attendees' questions. You did a great job. I appreciate it. So we will be taking a 15-minute break, and we will reconvene at 3 o'clock Eastern Time to discuss self-care when working in the food industry with Laura Louise Green. So we will see you shortly. Take care.